Money and power are what many people strive for. However, few people think about how to manage all of this if dreams come true. In such a situation, it is easy to lose your head, and all of this can end very tragically. Christopher and Jill Foster, together with their daughter Kirsty, moved to a new house 5 years before the tragedy. It was a huge estate on a large plot with stables and an old house located in the countryside of Shropshire, Great Britain. This place was of historical value. There was enough land to fully live on and raise a child, as well as provide comfortable conditions for the horses and dogs of the family. The couple looked at everything as if it were a real paradise. The Fosters were very friendly and loving and had a great time wherever they were. But on Saturday, January 26, 2008, there was a fire at the estate. The UK Rescue Service 999 was contacted by neighbors who saw flames coming from the broken windows. By the time firefighters arrived at the scene, the fire was raging in full force. The roof began to collapse, and in front of the firefighters, the ancient estate collapsed. It was very difficult to put out the fire. It seemed as if it were not the house that had caught fire, but a real tank of fuel. When the fire was finally brought under control, the fire safety staff found themselves amidst tons of charred building materials, much of which was destroyed. In the ashes, they looked for the cause of the fire and any possible victims, but during the first days, no bodies or traces could be found. Fire safety specialists concluded that the fire was not accidental. It had been deliberately set. Inside, they found pipes and numerous traces of oil, which acted as a catalyst. The stables, the family's garage, and premium cars were also destroyed by the fire. The police found the bodies of 2 horses and the dogs in the stables, all caught in the center of the blaze. It all looked like a ritual fire. The bodies of Christopher, Jill, and Kirsty were missing, and it was hoped that they had survived and were just away. However, the truth turned out to be much more sinister. Before the full extent of the tragedy could be discovered, investigators had to dig through the ashes. During the investigation, it was revealed that, on that weekend, the Foster family was planning to celebrate Bankers' Day. On Saturday, they were going to visit their neighbors for a barbecue, and on Sunday, they had planned a gathering with the neighbors and Chris's mother. However, the mother couldn't attend, so the meeting had to be rescheduled. She did not suspect that this telephone conversation with her son would be the last. A few days later, on Tuesday, Chris's mother visited the estate with her youngest son, Andrew. They were not coming for a celebration but had been informed of the fire. Law enforcement officers had contacted her and reported the fire. At that point, officers were searching for any information, as the Fosters had still not been found. The family had not been traced to any airports or train stations, and no one could find out where they had gone. The mother, who had not heard from her son, was deeply concerned. She believed the fire might have been due to faulty wiring, as the house was old, but criminologists suspected otherwise. They were certain that the house had been set on fire deliberately. This fire attracted widespread attention from the public and the media, given the wealth and status of Christopher Foster and his multi-million-dollar estate. The public's suspicions grew as police and firefighters could not provide any solid information. The investigation had to be extensive, as large parts of the house had to be dismantled just to determine what had happened. Finally, when they began removing the rubble, something unusual happened. A separate team consisting of about 200 people was formed to continue the search. During the process, one of the workers felt something crunch underfoot. It was not like the rest of the burnt building materials. Investigators began to realize that something significant might be buried beneath the debris. At first, investigators had not connected Christopher Foster to any major criminal activities, but soon they found out that, for years, he had been struggling with serious financial difficulties despite being a successful businessman. Law enforcement had already encountered several of his legal issues, including multiple court cases, though these were kept relatively quiet until the fire. The police now suspected that the fire had been set intentionally as part of a plan to distract from his financial issues and possibly flee the country. However, no one knew where the Fosters had gone, and their disappearance only seemed more suspicious as the investigation deepened. Law enforcement experts began to think that they might be dealing with something much darker than just an accidental fire. Finally, after extensive excavation, criminologists discovered the first human remains. These were found right in front of the fireplace on the first floor. The remains were confirmed to be human, and forensic experts began to examine them closely. The search continued as they tried to understand what had happened inside the house and to the Fosters. This tragic event would soon reveal much more than they could have ever imagined. The tragedy was noticed only due to the fact that some parts of the pile of burnt ash looked different from what the burnt building material seemed to be, more spongy. A detailed analysis showed that the bones had burned to such a state that right under the first partially preserved skeleton, there was a second one. Judging by the size, Jill and Christopher Foster's remains were found by the criminologists. The experts paid attention to several fragments remaining from the skull. It seemed that the cause of the woman's death was a gunshot. It took almost a day to dig up several parts of the skull, which were pieced together by detectives. After some digging, they discovered a .22 caliber rifle, which became the weapon used in the crime. This was confirmed by a burnt bullet, which was also found after several hours of intensive excavation. The hull was literally sifted through, and the Foster family's dogs, at some point, put the detectives into a stupor. They couldn't understand why the animals had been killed. It was believed that the residents of the house might have become victims of a robbery. But then, why take the time to deal with all the living things on the estate? This was confusing, and increasingly darker thoughts began to creep into the minds of the detectives, who had never encountered such a terrible crime in this normally quiet area. The first valuable clues were obtained after analyzing footage from CCTV cameras located outside the house. The storage media had miraculously not been destroyed. A man was caught on film before the fire. However, the footage was of poor quality, making it difficult to identify him with certainty. A stranger was seen walking through the area between the stables and the house, carrying a rifle with a silencer. The footage showed him shooting the animals before returning to the mansion. What happened next inside the house was still unclear, but efforts were made to identify the criminal. Eventually, detectives came to the conclusion that it was Christopher himself. This assumption sounded unthinkable at first, but after reviewing the footage, it was clear that the man in the recording resembled the Millionaire. He was seen walking several times between the stables and the house before the first signs of the fire appeared. It became obvious that Christopher had killed his wife and then shot himself. However, it remained a mystery. The remains of Kirsty were still not found. Kirsty, the couple's 15-year-old daughter, was known to be active, good-natured, and loved swimming. She was also involved in sailing, was excellent with dogs and horses, and had a close relationship with her parents. Given the circumstances in which her parents were found, everyone hoped that she had somehow survived and managed to escape. Unfortunately, the truth was more tragic. It took 6 days to discover the girl's remains. She had burned to death in her own bed, in the children's room. When the flames began to destroy the ceiling, her bed collapsed down. It was obvious that she had the time and opportunity to escape, as she was far from the source of the fire, but she didn't. She likely never even tried to escape, most probably because she had already died. The discovery of the remains of the 15-year-old teenager was another blow for the relatives of the Foster family. They loved Kirsty dearly and had hoped that she survived the fire. The condition of the girls' remains was as tragic as that of Christopher and Jill. Some of the bones literally crumbled in their hands. Criminologists had to use machines for further analysis. By this time, detectives had already formed a version of what had happened. According to the police, on the evening of January 26th, Christopher Foster decided to deal with his family, including the animals, and then provoke a fire, intending to die along with them. This theory was supported by various pieces of evidence, including the CCTV footage, which became one of the few irrefutable pieces of evidence in the case. However, there was one problem. No one who knew Christopher could imagine that he was capable of such an atrocity. The man was a successful businessman, a loving husband, and a caring father. He had everything he could want, so why would he destroy his own life and that of his family? Detectives spoke to relatives and friends of the victims. They all described Christopher as loving and kind. They were so stunned by the tragedy that even when shown videos of the killer with a weapon in his hands, they refused to believe it was Christopher. In addition to his positive qualities as a family man, Christopher was also very determined and goal-oriented. He had achieved everything he dreamed of from a young age, and his family was very proud of him. In return, he never abandoned those who needed him. Christopher had always had a peculiar fascination with fire. This is exactly what he built his business around. In the late 80s, he witnessed a disaster on an oil platform. The incident literally stunned him. A devastating fire took the lives of more than 100 people. Chris thought about the tragedy and decided there needed to be a new type of insulation for oil rigs to protect people from such a disaster. This idea completely captured him. He began experimenting with different substances and eventually invented a unique sealant that did not burst into flames but instead formed a protective shell. Chris patented his invention, but his struggle to convince investors was just beginning. He put everything on the line, gathering all the money he could. He staged a large demonstration fire that simulated a disaster on an oil platform. Foster hired specialists to analyze the fire service. All of this came out of his own pocket. He then connected his invention to the demonstration, which worked very effectively. Chris went to the bank, and after convincing investors, the project received funding. The success was stunning. At one point, Christopher had so much money that he didn't know where to spend it. His company earned millions installing systems in the oil industry. Despite his wealth, he kept moving forward, always striving to remain the best in his field. However, as often happens, power and wealth eventually corrupted him. At some point, Jill began to suspect her husband of cheating. Christopher's relatives were sure that during their marriage, he had dated at least 8 women. Jill was a decent housewife, but she was also a little naive, and so the affairs remained a secret. All of this came to light just 5 years before the tragedy. 5 years before the tragedy, Chris bought a house in Escalation for £1.5 million sterling, investing a lot more money in landscaping the property, installing a swimming pool, fountain, stables, making repairs, changing furniture, and buying expensive collector cars during this period. He proudly boasted that he paid for it in cash and did not owe anyone. The man specifically chose this place because it was secluded, safe, and ideal for his new hobby, hunting and fishing. There were extensive forested areas not far from the house where Chris could shoot pheasants to his heart's content. He loved his rifle and went into the forest 4 times a week, sometimes even more. He also loved skeet shooting. The man ordered several firearms for himself, one of which was found in the ashes. Christopher's new passion quickly grew into an obsession. He bought expensive rifles and pistols, which gradually appeared in every large room of the mansion. Later, he began to behave more suspiciously. Christopher became aggressive and nervous. One day, when Jill's pigeons flew into his barn, the husband tried for a long time to drive them out, but to no avail. When the birds didn't fly away, he simply shot them with his rifle, despite his wife's tears. He seemed completely indifferent to another alarming incident. When one of Kirsty's black Labradors accidentally bit him while playing, despite his daughter's protests, the man simply took the dog away from the house and shot it. However, no one thought that such behavior could lead to anything more terrible. However, on the August weekend of 2008, he opened fire on his daughter, his wife, and an animal, then shot himself in the head. At least that's what the detectives thought. To restore the picture of events, criminologists collected information bit by bit. In the literal sense, even to prove that the victims were shot by him, the skulls had to be reconstructed from separate fragments, parts of which were missing. This led to the fact that it took the police more than 2 months to restore an approximate picture of the events of the night of August 26th. The night before, the Fosters were relaxing with neighbors. They were grilling food, shooting skeet, and having fun. None of them noticed anything suspicious. Chris was in a good mood, joking all evening. The Fosters went home around 20:30, arriving at the house at 20:44. Jill went into the house, the husband went to drive the car into the garage, and Kirsty ran to let the dogs out. After a while, she went up to her room and turned on the computer where she talked to several school friends. At about 23:30, Christopher went up to his daughter's room and told her to go to bed. The girl didn't want to, so he turned off the internet. Kirsty complained to friends via SMS that her father was not in a good mood today. She said goodbye to her friends. This was the last message sent from her life. How further events developed is not known exactly, but it was clear that the woman was shot in the head at close range. However, more information was needed to understand how Christopher died and the whereabouts of the criminal's daughter's skulls. Only a third of her skull was found, as well as several teeth. This is all that criminologists could work with. The situation with Kirsty's remains was not the best for criminologists, but it was never possible to fully restore the skull. A little less than half of the bone remains were destroyed in the fire, including the most valuable areas where bullets could have remained. All efforts went to waste. Even after months of sifting through the hall, no material evidence was found to confirm the bullets or fire. When the detectives were ready to give up and write that the exact cause of death had not been established, they miraculously received the surviving recordings from internal surveillance cameras located in the house. It turned out that they captured his actions not only outside the house, but also inside. Here he was walking around with a rifle at the ready. First, he entered the matrimonial bedroom and shot his wife, then went to see his daughter. This allowed them to complete the picture. After the murders at 3:10 a.m., he took his rifle with a silencer and went to the dog enclosure and stables. By this time, his wife and daughter had already been shot dead in their beds. In 11 minutes, all the animals were dead. He shot the horses point blank in the head, drove the dogs into cages, and killed them in a similar manner so they could not escape. Then he dragged their bodies to the horses, after which the stable was set on fire. In addition, the man placed a van near the stable gate and shot out the tires, presumably to prevent the intervention of neighbors who might try to save the animals. As it turned out, not all the animals died from the shots. Some suffocated from the fire. The neighbors who lived not far from the Foster family actually heard the shots for 15 minutes, but they thought it was hunters shooting somewhere in the distance. All this is not surprising because it was deep at night. People slept and were disoriented. The neighbors sounded the alarm only when they saw a fiery glow outside their window at about 4 a.m. and called the rescue service. After the garage and stables were set on fire, the criminal went to the house. Christopher used his knowledge accumulated in the field of firefighting to destroy everything that surrounded him in the flames of a fire. For this, he laid flexible hoses into the house, pumping about 200 liters of oil inside from the basement where he stored technical fluids. The bodies of the killed animals were also doused with oil. However, it turned out that, in conditions of weak feeding of the fire, the scale of destruction was significantly smaller. Most of the horses and dogs survived, which allowed them to confidently reconstruct the picture of their last minutes of life. When the barn was set on fire on the first floor, he set fire to the oil and ran into the bedroom on the second floor, getting to the living bedroom where he probably shot himself in the head. The flames engulfed everything, so it's possible that he simply suffocated from the smoke. After rising to the second floor, the man deprived himself of the chance of salvation. The only thing that remained unclear was why all this was done. One of the family's neighbors helped the police understand why this might have happened. He noticed that Christopher had hardly left the house all day doing housework. It didn't seem like he was running any kind of business. As it turned out, 7 days before the fire, the bailiffs had slipped a letter through the gates of the house in Bastana, notifying Christopher that the estate had been seized. His wife, Jill, did not know about this, and could not imagine the scale of the financial difficulties her husband was struggling with. She did not get involved in the financial matters and was not inclined to spend large sums. Otherwise, she would have known that the problems began back in 2004. Everyone remembered very well how he boasted that he paid for the house in cash and didn't owe a cent. He had a powerful financial cushion and was a multi-millionaire. But where could all this have gone in a matter of years? The truth was revealed by Chris's accountant. In 2005, they had a conflict due to the fact that Chris did not pay a large number of fees to his suppliers who produced sealants. His employee did not draw up a normal business plan and did not calculate everything. Expenses and production costs were huge. Christopher later found a manufacturer who agreed to make the sealant at a lower price. All this could have helped, but product sales fell sharply due to the global financial crisis. The warehouses filled with insulation were unsellable. Meanwhile, he spent all the money he earned on luxury, and there was nothing to pay the suppliers with. In addition, accusations piled up from people who did not receive their wages. The accountant also spoke about his wrong approach to business. Chris was a brilliant inventor and developed a useful product on which much more could have been done with the right approach to business. But Chris had no entrepreneurial inclinations and went bankrupt during this period. The man was actively spending money, losing pounds sterling every month, and interest payments were growing, which he could not pay. By February 8, 2008, he still owed more than £300,000. However, an even bigger blow was the loss of his company in September 2007. He lost a lawsuit with a supplier and owed more than £1 million. No one knew about it. Although he hadn't worked for more than a year, despite the financial crisis, he continued to maintain his image as a multi-millionaire. Of course, he was in debt. For his rifles alone, Chris spent more than $100,000. In addition, the weapons had to be maintained, which only increased expenses. By November 22, 2007, his Swiss bank account was empty, and his debts had reached £4 million. Even then, he continued to hide the truth from everyone. He understood that even if he sold all his property, it would not be enough to cover his debts. Revelations occasionally broke through. For example, in November he communicated with his brother and admitted that he was not doing well, but he didn't go into details. In fact, this was the last message the relatives received from Christopher before the tragedy. The brother couldn't understand the problem, thinking that Christopher was simply sick or had too much stress, so he brushed it off. Even after all this information was revealed, it was unclear why Christopher decided to kill not only himself, but also his family, innocent animals, and burn down property worth several million. As it turned out, Christopher had communicated with several business partners and described the situation he faced, but without going into details. Whether he was really thinking about voluntarily dying from life is unclear. In fact, he was trying to cope with the problems that had piled up. 5 months before that fateful weekend, Christopher's doctor prescribed him antidepressants, which helped stabilize him a little. In the end of August 2008, a double murder was committed, along with arson and voluntary death. A few hours after the fire, the bailiffs arrived at the estate to seal up the property for confiscation. During the investigation, it was discovered that the women didn't die in front of the fireplace. They fell from the second floor along with the charred and completely destroyed bed through the collapsed floor. It is curious that before pressing the trigger for the last time, Chris lay down with his shot wife and hugged her. Apparently, the criminal, to the last, felt for his loved ones and wanted to be close to them. This indicated the style of those who decide to commit suicide and take everything they love with them. Unfortunately, due to the poor condition of the remains, criminologists were unable to determine whether Christopher shot himself or just lay next to his deceased wife and inhaled smoke. All of this remains speculation. 4 months after the incident, the Foster family was buried at the local village church. Jill's family insisted on burying Christopher separately from the family, while the mother and daughter were buried together. The relatives of the women hated Christopher for what he did. In addition, he deprived them of the opportunity to compensate for the damage caused by his financial fraud, which affected dozens of people. Chris's family assumed that the man was broken. He was too successful, and his success had gone to his head. He spent too much and considered himself invincible. He surrounded himself with luxury and built an ideal world, only to watch it all crumble. Ultimately, his breakdown was like a wild animal fighting in a cage. Unfortunately, all of this cost too many lives. Thank you for watching.